Rodanthi to organize this amazing seminar, and I feel really privileged to have the chance to talk with the great colleagues that I've been reading and citing since many years. So, well, thank you very much, Rodanthi, for this opportunity. I would like also to apologize if you hear some noise, because right now I'm on the field in the Magdalene Island. I'll show you that on the map later on, which is in the pleasure periphery, working with tourism and community I would say stakeholders on their climate change adaptation, doing some like more than humans entanglement thinking about it. And so internet connection is not easy here. And I managed to get a place which actually have a really good connection, but it's by the main road, and the fishermen are getting ready, getting their boat ready to go at sea to start a fishing season in maybe 6, 7, 8 days, depending on the weather. So there's a lot of trucks passing by the main roads right now. So if you hear them, just, I'd like to apologize. That's the best I could do, because anywhere else I could not have been able to actually broadcast in the in video conferencing in the right way. So and well, from the standpoint I am right now, I'll just take you with me in that, what I call the Quebec pleasure periphery, through also a historical trip about that. I would say that junctions between tourism and territories and the transformation of regional development, I would say policies along tourism. I've targeted 3 moments that, there's more than that, but that's all we could afford with the time. I'm not a geographer per se, but I work a lot with geography methods and authors, but I'm actually trained, and my PhD is in regional development, and that's you get like that layers of territories and politics, because regional development, it's a lot about, the action of the states and, on regions, and especially on peripheral areas, in what's interested me, and how, it shaped life, and how it shapes place, space, territories, and also, in a capitalist system, there's always capital hanging around. So I'll just leave that. Okay, so tourism for me is at the junction of territory and biopolitics. I wrote, on both recently, mostly in French, and I'm trying to build that understanding of that that intersection of territory and biopolitics, to understand how tourism act and shape, peripheral place. So if we go back to territory, it's a central concept used as a way to divide the world, but mostly to politically control it, especially in the geopolitical, I would say, Anglo-Saxon geography perspective. And it's also based on a stable, non-ambiguous spatial form to situate, the political action of the state. That understanding of territory that is quite generalized in the Anglo-Saxon geography is a Westphalian understanding of territory, about, the borders and how the states and enact those borders and define its own territories. But in 1979, you got Friedmans and Weaver, who actually published a book called Territories and Functions, where they kind of look at the geographical division of labor or of capitalism, and they identified, I would say, 2 poles. One, it's a functionalist understanding of space, where capitals and capitalism organize through space different functions, to produce goods and profit. And they counter it with the idea of territories, and Friedman and Weavers are North American, so they kind of frame it within that world, and territories being within that settler states understanding. It get more about some kind of an autonomy, a particular way to organize life in a place according to its contingency, but also its resources. But then when we look at the French geography, the notion of territoire, which have actually the same Latin root than territories, but doesn't mean totally the same, because it's closer to place. It's a more relational and less structural understanding of space, and it's anchored in a particular way of living in place, but that is translated politically and socially in what we call le projet de territoire, which negotiate with the state and through different scales, how, to live and be in place. So the territoire, it's also an entry point to study contemporary capitalism and how, it move and adapt and transform to, across place. And when we look at by biopolitics, because, politics of living in place, or, or not living in place, because as we will see later on, for me, it's definitely biopolitics. It's about organizing life in an area. And then for me, by biopolitics, through this presentation, I would mean the production of life marked by the desire to manage the lives of population and the very conceptualization of life and death of individual, to produce new form of subjectivity through language, value, and effect that is translated within the territory project. And in short, it's about how power and its mechanism in societies protect, regulate, hierarchize, or just abandon life. And for that, we have that long claim of tourism that as a solution for restructuring economies, through the development, discussion, and conversation, that's where tourism gets in. So, and there's a really strong advocacy for tourism as a regional development strategy, because why? There's low entry costs, high labor needs, and flow of new currencies. And you don't, and in the context, but right now, we have kind of a reversal where in our periphery, where before there was problem having access to capital due to the idea of the low entry cost of tourism making it interesting. Now we have like surplus capitals flowing there, and the high labor needs when in the context of deindustrialization and having all that labor force that was available, and all of a sudden we have labor shortage right now. So that the dice are different, right? In the last, the situation kind of changed in the last couple of years, but then still, you have that claim of tourism for restructuring economies, but then, for those advocates of it, they claim that it could turn depressed, restructuring economy into vibrant, thriving community, but then. When we look at the research, tourism development still relies on that mantra, but the criticism and doubt about it that are plenty. And quoting one of the work I did with a student of mine a couple of years ago, we look at Tadoussac, which is a successful tourism development community, in all the tourism indicator. But when you look at the social indicator, it's a catastrophe. You have like aging community, services closing, and living in place there is starting to be barely possible. And then the whole place closed during the winter, and you have like 400 people still living there. So have those issues. But at the same time, we went through a tough transformation of the peripheries, where transformation of the natural resource exploitation, the mechanization, digitalization of agriculture, forestry, the mining industry, demographic transformation with aging communities, with empty, I would say, age categories that just left, and strong environmental tensions with degradation of the environmental quality of some of the area that were deemed natural, but also conflicts of values and representation of environment between, I would say, in-place community or historical inhabitant and newcomer and tourism. And then it makes that periphery move, those transformation move towards, the leisure periphery status. where it goes from an agrarian, natural resources based to residential, second home, leisure industry based economy in the tertiarization of it, modify the value of place and re-hierarchize those places between themselves, land use conflict, gentrification, and for the governance of tourism, in which that's an important part that I will raise later on. It resegments space through a tourism lens that is not always coherent with historical and the lived division of space. Basically, like in Quebec, you have 11 administrative regions that are, kind of like echoing the historical region, but then you have 22 tourism regions. So, and it creates all kind of arbitrary, I would say, seizure into the understanding of place and space within the tourism system. So, but then when you think about the province of Quebec and its periphery, we have to look at to think at it as the frontier economy in a settler state context. And I will feed that argument with the work of my colleague Yann Fournis in Université du Québec at Rimouski, where I actually did my PhD, which through its political economy analysis say that the frontier economy of the peripheral areas in Canada, it's under tension in a bind between occupied territory, so what we call occupation du territoire, and inhabit territory, so habiter le territoire, which the state kind of root into the occupying territory perspective. So occupation du territoire derived from a military perspective on being on the land, occupying it, to kind of assume the legitimacy of a population over others on certain space. But within the evolution of that perspective of occupying territory or an inhabit territory, the state, in its occupying territory perspective, acknowledged market dysfunction at the periphery for businesses and tried to correct it, building roads, harbor, infrastructures, subsidizing fly-in, fly-out, which means, the high mobility of workers, while asking for the residents to find a way for their community to be viable, therefore not acknowledging that the market is dysfunctional at the periphery, at the frontier for the local communities. So what happens? So they end up having those build communities around resources. And once the resources it's over, they will pay out and subsidize the businesses to come and the multinational to come out of it, while they had to pay for the roads to get there. And they would say to the community, find ways to be able to stay there or just move. And that's where tourism usually comes in the discussion and say, okay, we'll stay and we'll do tourism. There's a case of a town called Murdochville that was a mining town and with a smelter plant. And when everything closed down, they had a referendum and the population said to the government, close this place. There's nothing we can do here. And what the government said, no, you had to stay there, but reinvent yourself through, tourism. And that was quite a particular way. You could buy a house for maybe $5,000 at that moment in that town because no one wanted to live there. But they paid, and this supported economically, the mining company and the smelting company to actually move out of it. So we have that kind of like binding between the government and the states who want to occupy territory and exploit resources in it, but actually it's kind of moving out and moving away from responsibility and understanding of the community who live there and want to keep living there. So that biopolitics of regional development, so in our North American context, that tension, for me, it's biopolitics, as it generates population management policies, population movements, and a distribution of the resources to support life and the quality of life in the periphery. So with the development discourse, those policies create space of exception, especially for businesses, that hierarchize people in place along the market discipline and sustain or abandons way of living. So I'm bringing you, the map to the Quebec. What I call the pleasure periphery would be the area around here, which I won't talk much because that's not the area that I study the most, a little area around here, but mostly you get everything east of Rivière-du-Loup, which is the Gaspé Peninsula, and that area around here with the Saguenay and Charlevoix. And right now I'm talking to you from here, Île-de-la-Madeleine, which is a really particular place that I won't talk that much today because it's a different way to organize the periphery, which is quite interesting, but that will be for another talk. I identified 3 moments to understand that biopolitics of regional development through tourism. One is called the Bureau d'Aménagement de l'Est du Québec, BAEQ, that was happening during 1963 to 66. The other one is the Plan Nord, the Northern Plan, which started at the in 2011 about the redevelopment of the really northern area. I won't look at the northern area, but the logic, the biopolitical logic of that development of that huge government plan kind of trickle to all kind of development around the province, and then to the pandemic. So, in the 60s, le Bureau d'Aménagement de l'Est du Québec was a large-scale planning initiative to develop the eastern part of the province, mostly the Gaspé Peninsula, that was deemed underdeveloped. It's still up to today the largest government-based rationally planned development initiative in Canada. The idea, it was to lower interregional inequalities in a kind of a modernization plan of the province. And so the idea was saying that the people who live over there should have access to the same services as people who live in Montreal, which is at that time was close to 1 million people city. But then the analysis and the decision that were made, it was to actually close all the small villages and concentrate people in the regional town, and they started to close down villages. There was 92 villages that were identified as not being viable, and at the people to move them out of there, and through a 2 years data collection process, and what they did, they closed down 11 of them. The way they were doing it, they would compensate really lightly the people to move away, and they would burn their houses to make sure that they don't come back. And the picture in the back, it's actually from that time. And it's one of the house in Saint-Paulin-de-Ribert, which is burning. Biopolitically, we had that rationally planned land planning initiative was the beginning of a dataification of life. That Bureau d'Aménagement de l'Est du Québec did an amazing job in some ways to actually document and produce data about how people live there and why they live there, and the numbers about it. But then the biopolitics of that modernity welfare state project, where everybody under the state would have access to the exact same services and resources, was interpreted in a way that disqualified their way of living on the land and to move them in the cities. Most of them end up in really low quality social housing, and end up finishing their life there. It was some kind of catastrophe in terms of eroding the social tissue of those areas. But then they didn't close the 92 villages that were identified. After 11, there was a social movement called the Dignity Operation, where people claim they had a dignity in the way, there was a dignity and a value in the way they could live on that land. And that social movement took so much strength that it actually stopped that really brutal ways of moving people away from the land. But the government moved into a attrition strategy in just using the low density argument to give less and less and less services and make it harder to live in those areas. And actually, out of the 92 villages, I would say, well, all of them that are like the 81 that were not closed, all of them are deemed like really with low social and economic development index, and also been receiving really, really low level of services. But the tourism dimension at that moment, within that redevelopment plan, there was tourism already, and it was done through the creation of enclave, you know, and especially, and the archetypical one of that moment is the Forillon National Park, on which part of my PhD thesis is about, where they actually run out of the land that is now a national park, 350 families, barely compensate them, once again, burn their houses to be sure that they won't come back. And a couple of years ago, add those, you know, nice boards saying that a long time ago, some people lived there and that's how they live, when it was maybe just barely 10 years ago. So what we see at that moment, it's a normalized generic tourism product that is developed through the motorization of society and the democratization of the cars, you know, and we have like that whole, I would say, Fordian way of developed tourism, and it territorially through the creation of enclave, you know, like national park, regional park, called that base de plein air, which are like natural area where you have like hospitality services, and the discourses about living there became a blur between precarity and authenticity. So precarity became kind of a erase with a discourse of authenticity. So people, you know, could visit and see the old way of living and see it as something authentic, something romantic, and economically something that is, well, some kind of development through tourism. Well, it was mostly hiding precarity. It's also the beginning of the DMO, the Destination Management Organization in Quebec, that end up redevising space along the tourism functions and kind of taking tourism out of the political sphere within organizations that basically just manage and market areas and are not, I would say, imputable or don't have to redeem politically to elected and local, I would say, political institutions, where they were kind of standing aside and serving their members with lots of the time at like the main stakeholders will be like hotels and different tourism infrastructure that were owned by interests at the center and not in the periphery. So we kind of jump in time and we get it in 2011, 2017. It's not that nothing happened, but then in terms of biopolitics, we got something that's totally different and have high impacts on how the state think about its peripheral territories. So there's a public initiative launched in 2011 to develop the region north of the 49th parallel of the province of Quebec. So it's mainly targeted at mining companies. It creates a whole regime of exception for those companies with ambitious infrastructure program, roads, harbors, airport. It also, that's really important, institutionalize the fly in, fly out of workers instead of relocation of workers that would end up creating communities around those resources. So it's a really functional extractivist vision of development without commitment to community. It is literally a development through camps. And you see one of those camps called the Raglan mine, you know, and there's nothing around. So, but then when we look at that idea on the whole province, and especially in the pleasure periphery, because we could not call the northern region of Quebec up north of the 49th parallel being a pleasure periphery, we see that extension of that non-inscribed in-place development, you know, through tourism in the other periphery. Through the rise of Airbnb, tourism growth in that periphery has been done through non-embedded in territory stakeholders. So kind of echoing the fly-in, fly-out of the mining workers and forest workers. We have that tourism that start to develop with, you know, technology like Airbnb, but also investment that are in favors and making it easy for people in the center to actually being business owners and having tourism activities in the periphery without being fully there, without being politically inscribed within the place. Yeah. So, and tourism is managed through DMOs that have really, really low political inscription, that kind of move away from the political debate, always bringing the management perspective and discourses. So you have that kind of seizure between two way of being in the periphery, you know. So you have like historical population that live there and try, you know, to earn a living through those areas, and you have like the touristification that come from the centers with strategy and investment that don't, you know, stimulate territorialized development. So, you know, they consume the landscape, but they still reproduce what they are doing everywhere else. And there's, I would say, high economic leaking within that, that way of developing the periphery. So jumping to the pandemic, what happened is we had like a huge lockdown in Quebec, like everywhere else. But something particular was that the lockdown was at the individual dwelling level, you know, like in a lot of places, but also at the regional level. But there was like you saw the picture, regional frontier and checkpoint that were established, restricting mobility. But during the first lockdown, second home owner could not quarantine in their second home. They had to be in their first home as it is identified through their, you know, state, bureaucracy inscription, which is really not within the usual way that you know, mobility is understood you know, in the province. So tourism at first was banned while mobility was limited to essential, but then when they lift the lockdown, you know, there was a run to the beach and the natures, but because you have to understand that half of the population of the whole province of Quebec is around Montreal. And then if you take the little stripe between Montreal and Quebec City, you had like another third. So basically you have like almost 2/3 of the population within that 200-kilometer stripe. And so when the lockdown was lifted, everybody ran over there. But two issue, you know, but during the first lockdown, there was all of a sudden an entre-soi, you know, people were being together, just people living there. And it was kind of a acknowledgement of the territory, of what it is to live in that place once you're, you know, you're seizured from the rest of society. And two issues were raised, you know, protecting society from the threat, and especially the economic apparatus, while managing the, well, sorry for the translation, the bare life that is threatened by the virus. And the translation of this tension was through the debate on essentiality, or we could say on bare life, you know, and tourism was not deemed essential. So it kind of bring a discussion, a conversation politically about what we do with tourism, you know, and I'm kind of closing with, so it brings that idea of occupying territories and inhabiting territories, because through the lockdown, what happened is you end up having a discourse of inhabiting territories with, you have only people that actually inhabit the place officially, and occupying territories, you know, so what it is to occupy a territory instead of inhabiting it. So when we come, if we go back to tourism within those perspectives, tourism with occupying territories, it's about maintaining population through mobile, non-inscribed people in place subject. Tourism growth of demand in a market discipline of life in place. What is touristifiable will survive, and attrition for everything else, you know, because once you bring the market as hierarchizing what can be, you know, saved through tourism, the DMO movements it's a post-political organization in Quebec, which manage and impacts more and more daily life in place, taking it away from the politics, the conflicts, and the political resolution towards a fully managed society and life. When you think about occupying territories, you have a complacency with Airbnb and platform economy. As dwelling is displaced, is seen as a non-optimal way of being, and the platform optimized what was deemed in decline. There was that old discourse in occupying territories about how Airbnb managed, to give value back to abandoned houses and places that were not livable anymore, through a resource exploitation regime. Second home, retiree, and teleworker flatten regional inequalities. Like when you look at the data from region to region, they flatten the regional inequalities in some way, bringing in discourses that they are like, that's really good development way through residential function of those peripheries. But then when we look at the detail, they create in-community inequalities, fracturing the fields, the territory as a political fields. So the pandemic transformation that happened in Quebec with tourism is that the lockdown, the regional frontier, and the run to holiday of 2020, it was a revealer of the pleasure periphery. All of a sudden, those areas could be reconceptualized again as pleasure peripheries, like in the 60s when they started to, like when they did that huge land planning. But then at the local level, what we say, it's a repoliticization of tourism, like local municipal town council taking, trying to, I would say, discipline tourism and pushing, aside or away DMOs, and saying, yeah, of course, you have you get your management goals of the DMO and of development, but at the local level, there's question that needs to be asked. So what we saw in the last couple of months is actually local authority kind of trying to discipline tourism to actually transform the biopolitical dimension of tourism at their local level, beyond the occupying territories, to bring an inhabiting territories discourse. So the rush to the beach and nature, to nature area of 2020, but also brought urban market dynamics to essential amenities like housing, food product, medical goods in territories that were experiencing decline in those services in the past. So they were having like really low cost of housing, access to medical goods in, that was quite acceptable. Food products were not that expensive, but all of a sudden when you had that rush and that all urban occupying place and territories function running to the periphery, all of a sudden they make those, essential amenities explode in cost and in accessibility. So that's part of what kind of reclaim that started also that movement at the local level, trying to, stop the second home rental, bring tourism taxes, reclaim areas for other use than tourism. And then you have an emergence of an inhabiting territory biopolitics to challenge the occupied territory of the states. And so when we look at that biopolitical analysis of tourism, in general, in the literature, it's the control dimension inspired by Foucault and the creation, the exception inspired by Agamben that is quite dominant in the literature that we have access right now. But those two focus, they tend to neglect the embedding of tourism in larger political field that enable possible forms of tourism or disable some form of tourism. So that quick analysis of the pleasure periphery of Quebec that I just show you expose how tourism was a way to support the economy of those territories without supporting inhabiting territories. It brought a movement during 40 years to hierarchize through the market local culture. So if your local culture was marketable and you could bring it to the market, you can kind of make it survive. But if you're not, you kind of disappear. So local inhabitants in those periphery have to fight for their right to exist, like physically, politically, and also symbolically to be there on their own ways. But then we have a repoliticization of tourism right now at the local level that creates new discourses for inhabiting territory, where tourism is not a driver to occupy territory, but a resource to inhabit them. The state is challenged to reinvest fields of action in which it was disengaged in the past 50 years, in housing, in some healthcare, like, because all of a sudden the population, during the pandemic, figure out that, they've been left out of those distribution of resources with concentration in the city in the last 50 years. So when we go back to again, then we underline that biopolitics, it's a break between localization and organization. But then isn't tourism a form of this break, where mobility aims to liberate localization while bringing back to a form of territorialization of the organization that's called a destination with the DMO, which are not politically inscribed, that are really like managerial, which in itself, it's an organization referring to strongly arbitrary localization, because they are on the function and the movement, the mobility of tourism, and not really always with the way of living in place, with borders that are drawn along functionalist criteria of tourism as market activity. But then the pandemic initiated a movement in Quebec periphery. Maybe that movement will die out by itself. I don't know. We don't know where it will be going. It's actually happening right now to reconsider this break in tourism with the will to discipline tourism through politics in a biopolitics of inhabiting territory, in trying to reconnect localization and organization. But of course, in that movement, there's all kinds of stuff happening, and there's a risk of territories turning inward, is very present, especially in, reactionary right-wing politics. But then there's also discourses framing environmental efficiency and density that try to counter that peripheral biopolitics of inhabiting territories. Well, of course, in a city, if you concentrate 1 million people on, I would say, 200 square kilometers, you have like efficiency criteria that you won't, in terms of mobility of energies, that you won't have in a more dispersed way of living in place. But in reverse, territories right now use tourism to reenact and legitimate some embedded territorial practices from the past, sometimes imagined past, but that are entangled with more than human territorial actant. Right now, where I am in the Magdalene Island, with the idea of climate change adaptation, we have those discourses that are trying to happen, about how to adapt in being inspired by their ancestor who arrived there in a really inhospitable environment and find ways to survive, in creating kinship and relation to more than human actant on their archipelago. So that's kind of what's happening right now, where we see municipal and local authority, bringing counter discourses to that neoliberal, non-inscribed in place tourism that is, really alterizing areas from their home population through a more, I would say, embedded biopolitics that is emerging, and that is really interesting to study right now. Where it will take us, where it will go, well, I don't know, but that's part of what I'm doing and studying, like in the last couple of months, and probably for the next 1, 2, or 3 years. So thank you very much. Any questions or comments, will be welcome. Thank you.